And if you're interested in the journey to awakening, I'd really encourage you not to attach your desire for awakening to your ideal self. I'd ideally want to be awakened, or to your ought self. I ought to be more awakened. But simply allow yourself to be the self that you actually are right now. So I'd like to say something about what we mean when we speak about ourselves. What is a self? From a psychological perspective. And one of the things that really interests me about the self is the idea that we all have, that we have an enduring, continuous self that somehow continues in time. And in fact, our experience of this self is not like that at all. But we forget. We're really, really good at forgetting the self we have recently had. We have a succession of selves through the day, but each time we move into the state of a new self, we forget the previous self. Let me give you a very, very brief example. So I'm a business school professor, and the school assesses us all the time, assesses our teaching. At the end of any program, we get a happy sheet that says, 4 out of 5 on this, 4.5 out of 5 on that aspect of the teaching, blah, blah, blah. And it's very easy to read these and take them seriously and think that they actually say something about what kind of teacher you are. So it's possible to get a bunch of them together in the same day. So I could be reading one of these and see, oh gosh, I'm scoring 4.7 on that program on average. Gosh, I'm a really good teacher. That's great. And I go away for a few moments feeling really good about myself, and my good teacher self is now in place, and there's confidence and happiness and a general sense of about myself. And then the next one I read scores me only at 4, or even on some things slightly less. And I go, oh my God, no, I can't do this work. I just can't do this work. I'm no good at it at all. I'm a bad teacher. And my bad teacher self replaces my good teacher self in an eye blink. And my bad teacher self doesn't reflect for one moment on the fact that I was a good teacher only 3 or 4 minutes before. I'm now a bad teacher, and I'm now inhabiting that self. And that's now predominant until something else takes over, and the next thing takes over, and the next thing takes over. So we go through our days moving from self to self to self to self. The happy self, the confident self, the contented self, the discontented self, the grouchy self, the unhappy self. And each of these selves always forgets the self that came before. It's the nature of things. We have no memory for, it seems, the selves that we have been. One of the features of the solitary retreat I did recently that I described was a feeling of being visited at one point by the selves that I had been recently. I was sitting in my armchair looking into the fire, and my mind turned to recollecting the self that I was when I landed at the airport in southern Spain. And I remembered that self, meeting my friend, being happy to be with him. And then the self that I was when I was sitting at a beachside cafe with him, having lunch before we went out into the mountain. And I remembered that self. And then I remembered the self that I was when I was walking with him through the town looking for a SIM card for him. And then I remembered the self that I was on the journey up the mountain. And then the self that I was when I arrived at the hut feeling really, really happy and content. And then the self that I was when the rains first arrived, and the feeling of slight anxiety and discontent as it started to be colder and I wasn't sure I had the right clothing. And so on and so on and so on, a range of selves just from the airport up into the mountain. And then I started to remember backwards and backwards and backwards and backwards. It was as if there was an entire procession of selves, an endless procession of selves that had brought me to that place. And almost as if I could sort of flick through my memories and see the different selves that I had been. It was an interesting, really revealing experience because it was so detailed. But this is not how we ordinarily go about our experiencing. Our minds are usually far too busy for that. Our working memory and our mental processing resources are usually far too caught up with the demands of our days to give any resources to remembering the past. And in some ways, from the brain's processing perspective, it's an inefficient use of resources. You really want to be paying attention to what's here now and what seems to be called for now, what I need now to be getting through whatever's going on and whatever's next. But this is something worth reflecting on, that we have this procession of selves behind us, that there's an infinite variety of selves. Now, there's more we can say about this because it turns out that consumerism, according to some researchers, is driven by a sense of our wanting to acquire in order to be the kind of self that we wish to be, a desirable self. We believe that the next smartphone, the latest smartphone, will somehow make us more desirable and higher status in the world in which we move. It'll give us a better kind of self. We'll be an improved self if we can buy that jacket or wear the latest fashion. Will be the right kind of self through having, through acquiring. So that's one of the ways in which consumerism is driven, materialism is driven, by this sense that the right kind of self is always somehow just out of reach, and if only we can get the right stuff, we'll become the right kind of self. So that's one thing that's worth reflecting on, one of the ways in which our behavior is driven and shaped. But another piece that's really quite interesting is some research that I'll refer to in the program notes. I was introduced to this by my friend John Teasdale in his book, What Mindfulness Really Is, or What Really Happens in Mindfulness. And it's this idea, it comes from another researcher, that we have three selves in any moment, really. The self that we actually are. This is what is happening right now. This is what is happening right now. This is the self I am now. This is the self I am now. And then the self that we feel we ought to be. And then the self that we'd ideally like to be. So these three are distinct. The self that we actually are, the self that we feel we ought to be, the self we'd ideally like to be. And when our attention is taken by discrepancies between the self that we ought to be and the self that we currently are, we fall into a sense of unworthiness, of not rightness, of a certain kind of despondency can come upon us. And if we turn our attention, if our attention is taken by the discrepancy between the self we'd ideally like to be and the self we actually are, we can get anxious and striving. We can get, I should be doing more. I should be somehow working harder at this. I should be doing this. I should be achieving this. So the self that we ought to be leaves us feeling, I'm not good enough. And the self that we'd ideally like to be leaves us feeling, I'm not doing enough. And the self we actually are is sort of somewhat left out of the picture. Now, awakening frees us from selfing altogether. We no longer feel that sort of anxious striving to be the ideal self, or the despondent failure of not being the self we ought to be. And if you're interested in the journey to awakening, I'd really encourage you not to attach your desire for awakening to your ideal self. I'd ideally want to be awakened, or to your ought self. I ought to be more awakened. But simply allow yourself to be the self that you actually are right now. And pay attention to what's here now. It's okay. It's all right. Allow yourself to be yourself right now, whatever it is. Just let it unfold. Things will be okay.